Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio from Monday, May 20th, 2024. International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor says he is seeking arrest warrants for 3 leaders of Hamas, plus Israel's prime minister and Israel's defense minister for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Coming up, we'll hear from the prosecutor, the prime minister, and U.S. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, Republican from New York, speaks to the Israeli Knesset, criticizing President Joe Biden's policies towards Israel and praising the policies of former President Donald Trump, whom she's endorsed in this year's presidential election. U.S. sends its official condolences after the helicopter crash killed the Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi, but makes it clear the U.S. opposes the human rights violations overseen by that president. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin holds another virtual meeting with the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, promising after that U.S. military aid to Ukraine to fight Russia's invasion will continue to flow. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announces another vote this week on a bipartisan border security bill that Senate Republicans blocked earlier this year. From NBC News, the International Criminal Court announced Monday it is seeking to arrest Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity stemming from the October 7th attack on Israel by Hamas and the subsequent invasion of Gaza by Israeli forces. NBC News writes, while it's unlikely the targeted Israeli and Hamas leaders will face prosecution, the arrest warrants could make it difficult for them to travel abroad, and a trial in the court would be especially embarrassing to the Israeli government, experts said. Chief Prosecutor Khan posted a 15-minute video. Here's a few minutes as he speaks about the arrest warrants on each side of the conflict. First, Hamas.
On the basis of evidence collected and examined and analyzed by my office, I have reasonable grounds to believe that 3 senior leaders of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Daif, and Ismail Haniyeh, bear criminal responsibility for the following international crimes committed on the territory of Israel and the State of Palestine from at least the 7th of October 2023. Extermination as a crime against humanity. Murder as a crime against humanity and as a war crime. The taking of hostages as a war crime. Rape and other acts of sexual violence during captivity as crimes against humanity and as war crimes. Torture during captivity as a crime against humanity and as a war crime. Other inhumane acts during captivity as a crime against humanity. Cruel treatment during captivity as a war crime. And outrages upon personal dignity during captivity as a war crime. These crimes were committed in the context of the ongoing armed conflict detailed in the applications and as part of a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population of Israel by Hamas and other armed groups.
The International Criminal Court Chief Prosecutor Karim in a video calling for the arrest of those top Hamas leaders. He also spoke about arrest warrants he wants issued for the Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Minister.
I can also confirm today that I have reasonable grounds to believe, on the basis of evidence collected and examined by my office, that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant bear criminal responsibility for the following international crimes committed on the territory of the State of Palestine from at least the 8th of October 2023. The crimes include starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering, serious injury to body or health or cruel treatment, willful killing or murder, and intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population, as well as crimes against humanity of extermination and or murder, persecution, and allegations of crimes of committing other inhumane acts. It's alleged that these crimes were committed in the context of the ongoing armed conflict and as part of a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population of Gaza pursuant to a state policy. Unfortunately, these crimes continue to this day.
The ICC Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan, part of his video put out today. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu posted his own video response.
The outrageous decision by the ICC Prosecutor Karim Khan to seek arrest warrants against the democratically elected leaders of Israel is a moral outrage of historic proportions. It will cast an everlasting mark of shame on the international court. Israel is waging a just war against Hamas, a genocidal terrorist organization that perpetrated the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Hamas massacred 1,200 Jews, raped Jewish women, burned Jewish babies, took hundreds hostage. Now, in the face of these horrors, Mr. Khan creates a twisted and false moral equivalence between the leaders of Israel and the henchmen of Hamas. This is like creating a moral equivalence after September 11th between President Bush and Osama bin Laden, or during World War II between FDR and Hitler. What a travesty of justice, what a disgrace. The prosecutor's absurd charges against me and Israel's defense minister are merely an attempt to deny Israel the basic right of self-defense. And I assure you of one thing, this attempt will utterly fail. 80 years ago, the Jewish people were totally defenseless against our enemies. Those days are over. Now the Jewish people have a state, and we have an army to defend our state. Notwithstanding the blood libels Mr. Khan has leveled, Israel will continue to wage this war in full compliance with international law. We will continue to take unprecedented measures to get innocent civilians out of harm's way and to ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches those in need in Gaza. Mr. Khan also sets a dangerous precedent that undermines every democracy's right to defend itself against terror organizations and aggressors. The ICC has no jurisdiction over Israel, and Mr. Khan's actions will not stop us from waging our just war against Hamas. But Mr. Khan's abuse of this authority will turn the ICC into nothing more than a farce. He's doing something else. He is callously pouring gasoline on the fires of anti-Semitism that are raging across the world.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, part of a video that he posted today. Story from Associated Press, Hamas also denounced the ICC prosecutor's request to arrest its leaders, saying it, quote, equates the victim with the executioner. And the AP story also notes a panel of 3 judges will decide whether to issue the arrest warrants and allow a case to proceed. The judges typically take 2 months to make such decisions. President Joe Biden putting out a written statement. The ICC prosecutor's application for arrest warrants against Israeli leaders is outrageous. And let me be clear, President Biden writes, whatever this prosecutor might imply, there is no equivalence, none between Israel and Hamas. We will always stand with Israel against threats to its security. Secretary of State Antony Blinken also putting out a statement which had a similar line. We reject the prosecutor's equivalence of Israel with Hamas. It is shameful. Later, the State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller had more at his news conference.
As the Secretary said in a statement a short time ago, the United States fundamentally rejects the announcement today from the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court that he is applying for arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials together with warrants for Hamas terrorists. There should be no equivalence between Israel and Hamas. None. Hamas is a brutal terrorist organization that carried out the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust and is still holding dozens of innocent people hostage, including Americans. Furthermore, the United States has been clear since well before the current conflict that the ICC has no jurisdiction over this matter. The ICC was established by its state parties as a court of limited jurisdiction. These limits are rooted in principles of complementarity, which do not appear to have been applied here, amid the prosecutor's rush to seek these arrest warrants rather than allowing the Israeli legal system a full and timely opportunity to proceed. In other situations, the prosecutor deferred to national investigations and worked with states to allow them time to investigate. The prosecutor did not afford the same opportunity to Israel in this case, which has ongoing investigations into allegations against its personnel. There are also deeply troubling process questions. Despite not being a member of the court, Israel was prepared to cooperate with the prosecutor and had made that clear. In fact, the prosecutor himself was scheduled to visit Israel as early as next week to discuss the investigation and hear from the Israeli government. The prosecutor's staff was supposed to land in Israel today to coordinate the visit, and instead, Israel was informed that the prosecutor's staff didn't get on their flight around the same time that the prosecutor himself went on television to announce these charges. These circumstances call into question the legitimacy and credibility of this investigation. Finally, this decision does nothing to help and could jeopardize ongoing efforts to reach a ceasefire agreement that would get hostages out of Gaza and surge humanitarian assistance in. Those are the goals that the United States is pursuing and will continue to pursue despite these actions by the ICC prosecutor. And with that, Matt.
That's it? Nothing else?
That's it.
Okay. All right. Well, let's start with that since you started with that. Just very briefly, you said that the actions, the announcement on television and cancellation of the flights of the staff call into question the legitimacy and credibility of the investigation. Did they call those into question for the entire court?
We are just referring to the actions the prosecutor has taken today. The entire court hasn't acted. The prosecutor has taken this initial action. We're going to see what the next step is. But certainly it calls into question the investigation that he has conducted and the action he has taken when you see him short-circuit a process that was underway to gather facts, which is what you expect any prosecutor, any investigator to do when they're considering pursuing such a case.
State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller at his news conference. More reaction to the ICC's actions from Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont. He writes, the ICC prosecutor is right to take these actions. These arrest warrants may or may not be carried out, but it is imperative that the global community uphold international law. Without these standards of decency and morality, this planet may rapidly descend into anarchy, never-ending wars, and barbarism. Senator Sanders says that Prime Minister Netanyahu has waged an unprecedented war of destruction against the entire Palestinian people, which has killed or injured over 5% of the population. And from House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, this statement: the ICC has no authority over Israel or the United States, and today's baseless and illegitimate decision should face global condemnation. International bureaucrats cannot be allowed to use lawfare to usurp the authority of democratic nations that maintain the rule of law. Israel is fighting a just war for survival, and the ICC is attempting to equate Israeli officials to the evil terrorists who perpetrated the October 7th massacre. It's clear the ICC's decision has been advanced due to the Biden administration's pressure campaign against Israel and its outlandish State Department investigations. In the absence of leadership from the White House, Congress is reviewing all options, including sanctions, to punish the ICC and ensure its leadership faces consequences if they proceed. If the ICC is allowed to threaten Israeli leaders, ours could be next. That was a statement from U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson. This is Washington Today. U.S. President Joe Biden's national security advisor, writes BBC News, has urged Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to connect the war in Gaza to a political strategy for the territory's future. Jake Sullivan met Mr. Netanyahu in Israel after holding talks in Saudi Arabia on Saturday. His intervention comes a day after War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz threatened to quit if Mr. Netanyahu did not come up with a post-war plan for Gaza. Mr. Netanyahu has so far not articulated a vision for what comes after the war, saying only that he is focused on total victory. That was from BBC News. U.S. Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, Republican from New York, fourth in the House Republican leadership, was also in Israel on Sunday, giving a speech to the Israeli Knesset, their parliament, in Jerusalem.
This is not Israel's fight alone. It is also our fight, the West's fight. In truth, total victory is about more than responding to one attack. It's about restoring a way of life. It is about securing the Jewish state so that it no longer faces threats of annihilation from any actor, whether from Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, or any other. And it is the United States' high honor and high responsibility to support Israel's effort. I have been clear at home, and I will be clear here. There is no excuse for an American president to block aid to Israel, aid that was duly passed by the Congress. There is no excuse to ease sanctions on Iran, paying a $6 billion ransom to the world's leading state sponsor of terror, or to dither and hide while our friends fight for their lives. No excuse, full stop. That's why I'm proud to have sponsored or backed every measure to aid Israel that has come before the United States Congress. Every single one. It's why I, as a senior member on the House Armed Services Committee and Intelligence Committee, we have helped secure billions of dollars for the Iron Dome, David's Sling, the Iron Beam, anti-tunneling technology, counter-UAS systems, and further development of emerging technologies, most recently in the supplemental aid package passed just last month. It's why I led calls for the White House to speak out against the corrupt ICC. And it's why for years I have been a leading proponent and partner to President Trump in his historic support for Israeli independence and security, including moving the U.S. Embassy to its rightful place in Jerusalem, the negotiation of the historic Abraham Accords, the greatest stride towards peace normalization in more than a quarter century, adopting the strategy to align U.S. Central Command with Israel, a change that fostered daily communications with the IDF, joint exercises, and crucial coordination with British and Arab partners that helped defend against the Iranian attack. And finally, President Trump's wise decision to call out UNRWA for what it is, a hive of anti-Semitism, and to eliminate every dollar of U.S. funding.
Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, Republican from New York, in Jerusalem, part of her speech to the Israeli Knesset on Sunday. A White House spokesperson, Andrew Bates, said in a statement on Sunday, "There has been no better friend to Israel than President Biden. He was the first American president to visit Israel during wartime and the aftermath of the horrific October 7th terrorist attacks, and the first president to order the U.S. military to defend Israel from a foreign nation's attack. As he has demonstrated, President Biden's support for Israel's security is ironclad. Unlike some figures on the right, President Biden did not rail against the Israeli government in the days after October 7th, nor has he ever praised terrorist organizations like Hezbollah." That statement from White House spokesperson Andrew Bates. From USA Today, Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi and Foreign Minister and other officials were killed in a helicopter crash in mountainous terrain near the Azerbaijan border. Officials and state media announced Monday they were traveling in a convoy of 3 helicopters from Iran's border with Azerbaijan in the country's mountainous northwest. After inaugurating a joint dam project, the helicopter went down in heavy fog in a remote area Sunday, and search operations were hindered by the fog, blizzard conditions, and difficult terrain. The bodies of all 8 on board were found Monday. Raisi's death is not expected, writes USA Today, to upend Iran's domestic or foreign politics, but it does come at a time of raised international tensions and increases speculation over who will eventually replace Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Raisi was viewed as a possible successor to the 85-year-old cleric. At the State Department, spokesperson Matthew Miller, in a statement saying that the U.S. offers its official condolences, and then he took questions about that.
I know you extended official condolences of the U.S. For the death of Iran's president and foreign minister over the weekend. The U.S. also participated in a moment of silence for President Raisi at the UN Security Council, and it sparked some controversy on Twitter. Does the State Department view that as appropriate, taking part in that kind of observance?
Let me say a few things. One, we have been quite clear that Ebrahim Raisi was a brutal participant in the repression of the Iranian people for nearly 4 decades. He was involved in numerous horrific human rights abuses, including playing a key role in the extrajudicial killing of thousands of political prisoners in 1988. Some of the worst human rights abuses occurred during his tenure as president, especially the human rights abuses against the women and girls of Iran. That said, we regret any loss of life. We don't want to see anyone die in a helicopter crash. But that doesn't change the reality of his record, both as a judge and as the president of Iran, the fact that he has blood on his hands. So I think most importantly, our fundamental approach to Iran has not changed and will not change. We will continue to support the people of Iran to defend their human rights, their aspirations to an open, free society and democratic participation, and we will continue to confront the Iranian regime's support for terrorism, its proliferation of dangerous weapons, and its advancement of its nuclear program in ways that have no credible civilian purpose.
And just as a quick follow, in the aftermath of that crash, did the U.S. help in recovery efforts in any way, or was it asked to assist?
We were asked for assistance by the Iranian government. We did make clear to them that we would offer assistance, as we would do in response to any request by a foreign government in this sort of situation, and ultimately we were not able to provide that assistance. We were asked.
Where?
I'm not going to get into the details, but we were asked by the Iranian government for assistance. We said that we would be willing to assist. It's something that we would do with respect to any government in this situation. Ultimately, largely for logistical reasons, we weren't able to provide that assistance.
Matthew Miller is the State Department spokesperson at his news conference. On the U.S. Senate floor, the Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, talking about the death of the Iranian president.
Last night, Iran confirmed that its president and foreign minister died in a helicopter crash. The condolences from sympathetic regimes were swift. The PRC declared that the Chinese people had lost a good friend. The Kremlin mourned a reliable partner. And Prime Minister Orban of Hungary, whose government has pursued deeper trade relations with Tehran in spite of Western sanctions, offered his thoughts and prayers. Well, I too would like to extend my condolences to the people of Iran for their long suffering under the brutal theocratic rule of the Islamic Republic. I suspect a great many Iranians would rather Western admirers stop lionizing a man known as the Butcher of Tehran or executing political prisoners. They might prefer that foreign leaders not further legitimize the regime that actively represses all of them.
Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, the Minority Leader on the Senate floor. A story from Business Insider. Multiple outlets, including Reuters, said the helicopter was a U.S.-manufactured Bell 212, a model that first entered service in 1968 and stopped being made in 1998. Iran's former foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, said the U.S. sanctions which prohibit Iran from purchasing U.S.-built aircraft could be partly to blame. In a phone interview with State TV on Monday, Zarif said the sanctions prevent Iran from having good aviation facilities. A White House spokesperson, John Kirby, was asked about this in an online audio news conference.
Now, as for this claim about U.S. sanctions being responsible, it's utterly baseless. The cause of the crash, of course, isn't clear, at least not clear to us. But I would note, Amr, that Iranian official sources were out there citing poor flying conditions as a cause for concern, specifically fog. And every country, no matter who they are, has a responsibility, their own responsibility, to ensure the safety and reliability of its equipment, and that includes civil aviation. So again, the totally baseless accusation, no truth to it. And it's not surprising, sadly, but not surprising that the Iranian regime will once again find a way to try to blame the United States for problems of its own making.
White House spokesperson John Kirby in an online audio-only news conference. And at the Pentagon, at a news conference with Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, this also came up.
For doing this. Mr. Secretary, I wanted to ask you about Iran. Does the Pentagon have any indication that the helicopter crash in Iran that killed President Raisi was anything other than an accident? And have you directed any force posture changes in case there's unrest following these deaths?
Thanks, Tara. Regarding the death of Iran's president in the very unfortunate helicopter crash, we continue to monitor the situation, but we don't have any insights into the cause of the accident at this point. And certainly, I know the Iranians are investigating, or will investigate, and so we'll see what the outcome is once their investigation is complete. In terms of our force posture, I don't have any announcements to make. And again, this is something that we'll continue to watch, and I don't necessarily see any broader regional security impacts at this point in time, Tara.
But at this time, you have no indication that there was anything other than an accident that brought this helicopter down?
Right. I can't speculate on what may have been the cause of the accident, Tara. But again, I think we'll learn more once the Iranians have investigated.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin at a news conference at the Pentagon. A story from AP. Iran's first vice president, Mohammad Mokber, was appointed acting president of the Islamic Republic on Monday after the death of President Ebrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash. Mokber, 68 years old, has largely been in the shadows compared to other politicians in Iran's Shiite theocracy. Raisi's death Sunday thrust Mokber into public view. He's expected to serve as caretaker president for some 50 days before mandatory presidential elections in Iran. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei made the announcement of Mokber's appointment in a condolence message after the crash. That from Associated Press. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin called the news conference at the Pentagon along with General C.Q. Brown, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to talk about Russia's war in Ukraine. The independent newspaper writes that Russia has lost more than 1,500 soldiers in the past week in the grinding war in Kharkiv, even as Vladimir Putin claimed he has no plans to take Ukraine's second largest city. In the past 24 hours, Russian troops have tried to break through Ukraine's defenses using aircraft and guided aerial bombs, and there have been around a dozen ground skirmishes. That was from The Independent. Secretary Austin and General Brown attended a virtual meeting this morning of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, the about 50 countries which have been arming the Ukrainian military, and then there was this news conference. Here again is Defense Secretary Austin.
We met today at a challenging moment for Ukraine. Putin's forces have opened another front to seize sovereign Ukrainian territory. And the Kremlin's invaders are obliterating Ukrainian villages, and killing innocent civilians, and bombarding civilian infrastructure, including dams and power plants. Ukraine's defenders are in a hard fight. But Russian troops are paying a high price for Putin's aggression. Now, Putin is betting that eventually Ukraine will fold. And he's betting that this contact group will crumble, but he's wrong. And today we saw again why. Ukraine is fighting for its life, which gives it the huge strategic advantage of a just cause. And meanwhile, Putin is trying to wage a 19th century war of imperial aggression in the world of 2024. That's a terrible idea and a terrible strategy. Ukraine's forces are fighting the Kremlin's war of choice with ingenuity and skill. And they are making excellent use of the capabilities provided by the members of this contact group. We spent a lot of time today on life-saving air defense systems, which are helping Ukraine stave off waves of Russian missiles, Iranian UAVs, and North Korean munitions. And we'll continue to push to ensure that Ukraine owns its skies and can defend its citizens and its civilian infrastructure far from the front lines. The United States and our allies and partners worldwide remain laser focused on Ukraine's near-term requirements in Kharkiv and elsewhere. And we'll keep pushing to find swift solutions to Ukraine's most pressing needs.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin at a Pentagon news conference. The United Nations Security Council held another meeting today at Russia's request to talk about U.S. and other Western aid to Ukraine. Russia's ambassador to the UN is Vasily Nebenzia. Here is part of his speech. You'll hear the interpreter.
Among Western warmongers and backers of Kyiv, people are in a good mood because the U.S. has allocated its long-awaited large packet of military assistance to the Zelensky regime. Ukraine really is something is trickling down, and the local senior corrupt officials are happy about this. Although the lion's share of these resources are going to be spent in the US itself, and American civil servants are making no bones about this, in particular, as admitted by the head of the Pentagon, Mr. Austin. In the April tranche of $61 billion, about $50 billion will be spent in the military-industrial complex of the US. And we should add another twist that he mentioned. The largest weapons manufacturers, RTX Corporation, Lockheed Martin, and General Dynamics, a couple of weeks before the decision was taken on allocating the military aid package, in order to earn more money, increased their prices by 5.7%. There's a sharp increase in the capitalization of Western military corporations as well. The undoubted leader here is the German Rheinmetall that is controlled by an American investment company, BlackRock. From February 2022, its capitalization increased to 547%. You don't believe me? Well, listen to the Ukrainian bosses. This is what the Ukrainian boss said regarding the new American tranche in a recent interview with ABC. This money is not being given to Ukraine. This money is spent in American factories and will create jobs in the US. That was a quote. Furthermore, military experts say it's clear that there's no wonder weapon that the West can give to Ukraine and that can reverse the extremely negative trends that the Ukrainian army is seeing on the battlefield.
Russia's ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, at today's UN Security Council meeting, called by Russia on the topic of Western aid to Ukraine. Associated Press writes the U.S. has now provided about $50.6 billion in military assistance to Ukraine since Russia invaded in February 2022. Washington Today continues in a moment.
The House will be in order.
This year, C-SPAN celebrates 45 years of covering Congress like no other. Since 1979, we've been your primary source for Capitol Hill, providing balanced, unfiltered coverage of government, taking you to where the policies debated and decided, all with the support of America's cable companies. C-SPAN, 45 years and counting, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. Story from CBS News. House Republican leadership said Monday that a Senate effort to revive a once-failed border security measure is dead on arrival in the lower chamber, but the legislation may not make it out of the Senate. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said Sunday in a letter to colleagues that the chamber this week would again take up the border legislation negotiated by a bipartisan group of senators earlier this year. The bill, which came as part of a broader foreign aid package, was quickly rejected by Republicans after former President Donald Trump expressed his opposition. Senator Schumer wrote in his letter, "On cue, many of our Republican colleagues abruptly reversed course on their prior support, announcing their newfound opposition to the bipartisan proposal. By contrast, Democrats' commitment to act never wavered. That is why the Senate is prepared to take up the Bipartisan Border Act as a standalone measure this coming week." That was from CBS News. C-SPAN spoke this morning with The Hill's congressional reporter Michael Schnell about what's in the bill and why the Senate Democrats are bringing it up for another vote.
This is the bipartisan border deal that group of Senate negotiators, James Langford, Kyrsten Sinema, and Chris Murphy, struck back in February. It would essentially amend some asylum laws. It would end what's the so-called program called catch and release, and it would give the president authority to shut down the border if a certain number of individuals cross the border, if that reached a certain threshold. This was the deal that had finally come together after months of those painstaking negotiations that initially convened after Republicans had demanded that any aid for Ukraine move alongside border security provisions. So that Senate group convened. They came to an agreement, unveiled this deal, which was essentially really a stunning matter because border security and immigration reform has been something that has bedeviled lawmakers for years. But then very quickly after, it became clear that this bipartisan border deal would not make it over the finish line. Republicans casting doubt on the significance of the legislation. And really, the final straw was former President Trump coming out and urging Republicans to vote against it. So essentially, Senate Republicans had blocked this legislation from moving forward, and then Congress went ahead with considering foreign aid without border security. Now Schumer is trying to come back to this, teeing up another vote on it. He recognized in his Dear Colleague letter last night that this has a slim chance of passing, knowing that there would likely be defections on both the side of Republicans and Democrats. But essentially what this is it's a political move as we close in on the November elections and as the border continues to surge and be a top issue on the minds of voters. This is a way for Democrats to flip the switch on Republicans to do some messaging on the border, and B, give some of those vulnerable Senate Democrats, top of mind is John Tester, an opportunity to cast a vote on the record in support of cracking down on the situation at the southern border. So all that being said, Greta, we are finally going to see this vote this week. It is all but sure to fail, but the political ramifications, Democrats at least are hoping, could be significant.
Will any Republicans vote for it?
It is very unlikely that will happen. The Republican negotiator, James Lankford, again, he was the conservative emissary who worked day and night tirelessly for months to come to a consensus. He cast out on this strategy last week in an interview with Newsmax, essentially saying that this is not a serious effort, that he had not received any outreach from Democrats to try and move the ball forward in terms of border security, essentially saying this is a political gambit as we close in on the November election. So cast James Lankford to the side as a potential Republican yes note. There were a few others back in February. I believe it was people like Mitt Romney and some other more centrist-minded individuals like that. We could see them come on board and vote for it this time. Still no indication. That Dear Colleague letter came out late last night. But again, if you don't have James Lankford, the GOP negotiator, I think that's a really good tell that there's not going to be significant, if any, Republican support this time around.
Michael Schnell, congressional reporter for The Hill on C-SPAN's morning program, The Washington Journal. In the afternoon, the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, spoke on the Senate floor about the bipartisan immigration and border security bill and the revote that is scheduled for this week.
3 months ago, Madam President, 3 months ago, Senate Republicans blocked the strongest, most comprehensive border security bill we've seen in a generation. This week, Republicans will get another chance to do the right thing. Border security, we all know, is one of the most contentious issues that we have to wrestle with in Congress. But most people agree the status quo cannot continue. Our southern border is in desperate need of more resources, and our immigration system is in serious need of repair. President Biden in recent weeks has taken many actions to increase sanctions against human rights abusers, reform asylum, and enhance drug enforcement to the maximum extent his office allows. But as our Republican colleagues have said for years, the only long-term solution to the border is bipartisan legislation from Congress. Well, there is good news. Such bipartisan legislation does exist and is ready to go. I'm talking, of course, about the Bipartisan Border Act negotiated earlier this year by Senators Murphy and Sinema and Lankford, and endorsed by the National Border Patrol Council, the Chamber of Commerce, and the very conservative Wall Street Journal editorial page. This week, the Senate will have an opportunity to move again on this bill. For the information of my colleagues, tomorrow I plan to file cloture on the motion to proceed to the Bipartisan Border Act. The Senate will then vote on our bipartisan border bill on Thursday. All those who say we need to act on the border will get a chance this week to show they're serious about fixing the problem. Let me repeat. The Senate will vote on our bipartisan border bill on Thursday. All those who say we need to act on the border will get a chance this week to show they're serious about fixing the border. I implore my Republican colleagues to join us in advancing this bill. We're going to need bipartisan support if there's any hope of getting this bill done. I will be clear. We do not expect every Democrat or every Republican to come out in favor of the bill. But as I've said before, over and over again, the only way to pass this bill is with broad bipartisan support. I expect to see that on the Democratic side, and I hope we'll see it on the Republican side as well.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, on the Senate floor. The House Republican leaders, the Speaker Mike Johnson, Majority Leader Steve Scalise, the Whip Tom Emmer, and the conference chair Elise Stefanik putting out a joint statement saying, should this bill reach the House, it would be dead on arrival. They write, for more than 3 years now, congressional Democrats have stood by while the Biden administration has opened our borders to criminal drug cartels, terrorists, and untold millions of illegal immigrants. Now Leader Schumer is trying to give his vulnerable members cover by bringing a vote on a bill which has already failed once in the Senate because it would actually codify many of the disastrous Biden open border policies that created this crisis in the first place. That was the joint statement from the House Republican leaders. Congresswoman Nancy Mace, Republican from South Carolina, was interviewed on Sunday on Fox News.
Chuck Schumer, Congresswoman, blamed Republicans in the House for the death of that border bill. He said it was bipartisan, said it had bipartisan support, but he blamed House Republicans for the death of the bill. Is there any chance that it gets passed this time around, do you think?
Well, it's hard to say. I know in the first rendition of the bill, when I saw it go through the Senate last time, there were a lot of loopholes, a lot of exceptions. For every good idea in the bill, there was an exception on the very next page, which really made the bill not worth the paper it was printed on. And when you look at the idea of, hey, when 5,000 people cross the border, we're going to just shut the border down. This country has never shut the border down like that in any way, shape, or form. And if you look at Trump's policies, if you were just to use, for example, Title 42 and remain in Mexico, if you just reinstated those two policies, you could stem the tide of illegal immigrants coming across the southern border by about 80%. What I don't want to see is contentiousness. This is a number one issue. I live in a purple district. 40% of my voters are independent. This is the number one issue facing our country in every swing district, every purple district, every purple state, of which, by the way, Joe Biden is losing to Donald Trump right now.
Congresswoman Nancy Mace, Republican from South Carolina, interviewed on Sunday on the Fox News channel. Reuters reports on the views of two Federal Reserve vice chairs about inflation and when the Fed may start cutting interest rates. Vice Chair Philip Jefferson saying on Monday the recent ebbing in some key price increase indicators is encouraging, but it's too soon to know whether inflation is back on a sustainable path to 2%. He spoke at the Mortgage Bankers Association conference in New York. And U.S. inflation data through the first months of 2024 has been disappointing, Fed Vice Chair for Supervision Michael Barr said on Monday, leaving the central bank short of the evidence it needs to ease monetary policy. Barr spoke at the Atlanta Federal Reserve Conference on Financial Markets in Florida. Also at that Florida conference, the Federal Bank of Atlanta President Raphael Bostic, who was interviewed by Bloomberg Television.
I'm not going to ask you when you're going to cut rates because nothing's probably changed in your view that it's not time yet, you need more confidence, and you've been the one saying maybe one later this year. That's the same, right?
Nothing has changed. Well, first of all, good morning. It's good to see you and welcome to the conference. It's good to have you here. No, what you said is exactly right. The numbers have come in for the first part of this year, very bumpy. And it really suggests that inflation is going to come down far slower than I think many had expected. And so rather than focus on numbers of cuts and all that kind of stuff, really the issue right now is when are we going to be certain that inflation is clearly on its path to 2%? I think it's going to take a while before we'll know that for sure.
Well, what is it that tells you that maybe you'll only get one or you might get no cuts this year? What do you see in the economy?
Well, we do a lot of talking to business leaders, and what they're all telling us is things are slowing down, but they're slowing down very slowly and coming off of pretty high record levels of profits and revenue. So in that instance, there's going to be continued momentum in the economy, and that momentum is just going to take a while to play through. The other thing everyone tells us, though, is that pricing power is weakening. They do know that the expansion and large growth is not in their outlooks and on the table. And so for me, that says, yeah, it's going to slow down, it's going to get there, but it's only going to be eventual.
Is it likely that inflation doesn't go down or that it could go up again?
Well, as you know, anything can happen. My outlook is really that inflation will continue to fall through this year, and into 2025, I think that it will take quite a while for us to get all the way to 2%, but I do think we'll get there. But of course, the unexpected can always happen, and we've seen that through the last 3 or 4 years, where the pandemic was not expected, a war in Europe wasn't expected, and they do send ripples through the entire economy. If that happens, we'll just have to be ready and then respond as appropriate.
Federal Bank of Atlanta President Raphael Bostic interviewed today on Bloomberg Television. The next Federal Reserve Board meeting is June 11th and 12th. Wall Street today, the Dow down 196, NASDAQ up 108, S&P up 4. Story from Politico, FDIC Chair Martin Gruenberg on Monday announced he's willing to step down from the agency he has served for nearly 2 decades if a successor is confirmed after damning reports of a toxic workplace culture at the bank regulator led lawmakers to call for him to leave. The announcement comes after Senate Banking Chair Sherrod Brown, Democrat from Ohio, called on President Joe Biden to replace Gruenberg. Brown said in a statement that there must be fundamental change at the FDIC, which ensures more than $10 trillion in bank deposits and oversees thousands of financial institutions, in a move that is likely to turn the tide against the agency head with other Democrats as well. He said those changes begin with new leadership who must fix the agency's toxic culture and put the women and men who work there and their mission first. That was from Politico. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's free evening newsletter word for word and get the stories making headlines in Washington emailed to you every day. You can sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.